1996, Human Entertainment in Japan released Clock Tower for the Sony PlayStation. It should be known that in Japan the game was titled Clock Tower 2 because there was a previous Clock Tower game made. Development officials had success with the previous Clock Tower released in 1995 for the Super Nintendo console, and noticing the success of the original Resident Evil game also released in 1996 for the Sony PlayStation. The story of the original Clock Tower had it that the main character of Jennifer Simpson, an orphan living in the fictional Granite Orphanage in Norway. Other orphan children are Laura, Anne, and Lot, as the group of them are adopted in September of 1995 by a wealthy recluse by the name of Simon Barrows, who lives in a mansion called the Clock Tower due to a clock tower being its most visible feature. After the girls arrive at the mansion, Mary, the woman who had brought the group there, later leaves to find Simon. After a period of time, with no one returning to see them, the group becomes anxious and Jennifer offers to see what the situation is. While she's leaving the room, a scream is heard. Jennifer rushes to where the group are, but they're missing. Depending on the decisions made, either Laura or Anne is killed, and she's stalked by a murderous boy who has a deformed appearance, wielding a gigantic pair of scissors, whom is called the Scissorman. Through events in the game, Jennifer searches for Mary's true intentions, as well as trying to save herself and the other girls with her in the clock tower, as she and the others eventually escape. After the events of the first game, the sequel has Jennifer Simpson being adopted by Helen Maxwell, an assistant professor of criminal psychology in Oslo. Jennifer undergoes treatment for her experience at a research building in order to learn more about the Scissorman murder case at Simon Barrows' mansion and helps cope with the trauma. However, a series of brutal murders made national news in Norway, and it appears that the Scissorman has returned. The game alternates between choices that Jennifer or Helen can make, escaping from the Scissorman within the research building. Eventually, Scissorman is killed and Jennifer or Helen is safe from his threat. The concept of the Scissorman made him one of the most terrifying villains of the early to mid-1990s. When released, the game was considered a commercial success, and developmental staff commented that some of the success came from gamers being interested in horror due to Resident Evil. The threat by Scissorman to Jennifer or the other adopted girls, or even Helen, and the fact that they had few weapons to defend against him made the atmosphere in the game naturally, undeniably tense. The player often had to consider the situation before reacting to Scissorman's actions based on the plot of the game and choices made up until that said particular point throughout the game. Critics and analysts commented that due to the slow and highly suspenseful nature of the game, it didn't have the jump scares and quick fear often seen in the Resident Evil franchise. The concept of a killer wielding a gigantic pair of scissors and murdering his victims in such a gruesome method also caught public imagination and considered it a new and different way to portray a criminal in video games. Due to the release of the video game, it was considered one of the first true horror games for the Sony PlayStation, and while Resident Evil relies on guns to kill monsters and zombies, a somewhat simplistic approach to horror and suspense, the Clock Tower games had a more thoughtful and slow approach to the scare factor for the main character or even the player. The Clock Tower franchise had two more games, Clock Tower 2, The Struggle Within, and Clock Tower 3. These two games were not related to the original two games, due in part to Scissorman's unique aspect as a video game villain and the situation of the first two Clock Tower games. It's often said by fans of the game that it deserves a reboot and a reimagining of the story for the modern era of gaming. Sometimes a character can be forgotten because some don't understand the interpretation of a character.